Welcome back, book buddies! Today we are going to read all 24 books from the Mr. Men, Little Miss Advent Calendar 2021. Let's go! Day 1. Little Miss Giggles and the New Job. Can you guess what Little Miss Giggles does every morning when she wakes up? Yes, that's right, she giggles. And it's the same story all day, every day. The tiniest things make her giggle and giggle. Some people love Miss Giggles giggling, but some don't. Little Miss Greedy, for instance. I'm sure you can imagine what Little Miss Giggles did when she saw Little Miss Greedy eating an enormous cake. She giggled, of course. Little Miss Greedy thought that Little Miss Giggles was giggling at her. But in fact, Little Miss Giggles was just giggling about her new job. On that particular day, Little Miss Giggles was even happier than usual because she was starting a new job as a waitress in a very smart restaurant at the golf course. "Don't forget," said the manager in a very important voice. "This is an eminently, extraordinarily, impressive fancy restaurant. The service must be impeccably perfect." And what did Little Miss Giggles do when she heard these words? She giggled, of course. Her first customer was Mr. Grumble. "Ah, at last," grumbled Mr. Grumble, when Little Miss Giggles came to take his order. And of course, as usual, she couldn't keep a straight face. It was the same when she brought him his food. She just couldn't stop giggling. Mr. Grumble was not at all pleased. "And what do you find so funny?" he asked crossly. "Are you giggling at me? I must speak to the manager right away." "I'm here at your service, Mr. Grumble," said the manager, impeccably polite. "Your waitress is giggling at me," grumbled Mr. Grumble. "In fact, she won't stop giggling." "Please accept our most serious and sincere apologies," replied the manager. "I can surely assure you that it won't happen again." "Hee hee hee," giggled Miss Giggles. "Little Miss Giggles," said the manager importantly, "Mr. Grumble is one of our most difficult customers, therefore please do not giggle in front of him." "But I'm not giggling at him," explained Miss Giggles. "I'm just giggling because I'm so happy and so much a big giggler." "Let me give you a different job," said the manager. "Please take these drinks out to the golfers. And do try to be seriously serious and sensible." Little Miss Giggles promised to do her best. Do you think she will be able to be seriously serious and sensible? Mr. Snooty had just hit a very good ball. That is to say, he had hit a normal golf ball very well. The ball was just right next to the hole. "Ah, good shot, Mr. Snooty," said Mr. Happy. "Not bad, I agree," said Mr. Snooty, "but I know I can do better. On my next shot, the ball will go straight in the hole." But his next shot did not go well. He missed. And at that moment, Little Miss Giggles arrived with the drinks, happily giggling to herself. "I must speak to the manager at once," cried Mr. Snooty. And no sooner had he spoken than the manager arrived. "This young person has made me look ridiculous in front of my friends," said Mr. Snooty rudely. "In fact, it was entirely her fault that I had lost the game." "Please accept our most serious and sincere apologies," said the manager once again. "I can surely assure you that it won't happen again." And that was why Little Miss Giggles was sent to work in the golf club shop. And in the shop, Little Miss Splendid and Little Miss Bossy were trying on some truly ridiculous hats. I don't need to tell you what Little Miss Giggles did next. "We must find the manager at once," shouted Little Miss Bossy, bossedly, dragging Little Miss Splendid away with her. I'm tremendously, terribly sorry, explained the manager, but I'm deadly unable to let you work here any longer. But even with the bad news, little Miss Giggles couldn't stop giggling. Do you think she'll be able to find another job? On her way home, little Miss Giggles walked past the nursery. She could hear the babies that weren't giggling. They were crying, sobbing and bawling. What a terrible noise. The poor lady who was in charge of all the crying babies wasn't giggling either. She was wondering how she could cheer them all up. Little Miss Giggles walked into the nursery, giggled at the babies, and, as if by magic, they stopped crying. In fact, they started to smile and laugh and giggle back at little Miss Giggles. This time, little Miss Giggles had found the perfect job. And ever since, little Miss Giggles is happier than ever. When she wakes up in the morning, at least she has found a job where the giggliest giggles aren't always her own. The end. Day 2. Mr. Tickle saves the day. What do you think is Mr. Tickle's favourite thing in the whole world to do? Yes, of course, it's tickling. Oh, Mr. Tickle. In the street or in the park or in the shops, everyone who meets him knows that they are about to get tickled. Even little Miss Shy can't hide from the tickles. Tickle, tickle, tickle. Whatever next? Some people think that if they stay at home, they'll be safe from tickles. Well, they're wrong. Mr. Tickle finds a way to tickle them wherever they are. His arms are so extraordinarily long that they can creep and sneak anywhere, even down the chimney into Mr. Slow's living room, where Mr. Slow is sitting in an armchair reading the newspaper. Nothing can stop Mr. Tickle's tickles. After a while, people had had enough. The baker, the ice cream seller, everyone announced that it was exhausting to have to work and laugh at the same time. They had had enough of Mr. Tickle's tickles. As soon as he came into town, bang, bang, they closed their doors and they shut up their shops. Nobody likes me, moaned Mr. Tickle to himself. I don't do any harm. I just can't help tickling people. But it seems that people don't like his tickles, and that made him very sad. Boing, boing, boing. Not far away, a little girl was bouncing a ball that her grandmother had given her. Higher, higher, she cried as she laughed and played. The ball bounced higher and higher into the blue sky and got stuck in the branches of a tall tree. Oh, what shall I do? Cried the little girl. Don't worry, I'll help, said Mr. Small, who had heard her cries. Mr. Small climbed such a tall tree, but somehow or other he hopped from branch to branch. Mr. Small managed to reach the ball. He threw it down. Suddenly, the ground seemed very far away to Mr. Small. Mr. Small began to feel dizzy. He held on tight onto the branch and tried not to look down. The ball had been rescued, but now Mr. Small was well and truly stuck up the tree. Don't worry, I'll help, said Mr. Bounce, who was passing by. I'll bounce myself up the tree and help you down. Bounce, bounce, bounce. Mr. Bounce bounced higher and higher and higher. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bounce high enough. Poor Mr. Small is still stuck in the tree. Don't worry, I'll help, said little Miss Magic. She raised her magic wand, and suddenly the tree was covered in sweets. Oops. Thank you for the sweets, said an unhappy Mr. Small, but I'm still stuck in this tree. Don't worry, I'll help, said Mr. Strong. and using all his strength, he began to pull the tree right out of the ground. "Stop, stop!" cried poor Mr. Small. "I'm going to fall." By now, quite a crowd had gathered around the bottom of Mr. Small's tree. Little Miss Sunshine had an idea. Perhaps Mr. Tickle could help. "Mr. Tickle," she called when she got to his house, "come quickly. We all need you." They needed him? Forgetting his sadness, Mr. Tickle ran to the tree and reached up with one of his extraordinarily long arms. Gently, he lifted Mr. Small back down to the ground. "Thank you, Mr. Tickle," said a very relieved Mr. Small. "I'll never forget how you helped me." And the friends agreed that the very best way to thank Mr. Tickle was to let him give them all an enormous tickle. Mr. Tickle didn't need telling twice, and reached out his long arms round all his friends and he tickled until they were all falling about with laughter. The end. How funny! Day 3. Little Miss Bossy saves the zoo. On this particular morning, the streets were empty. There was nobody in sight. All the shops were closed. "Where is everybody?" shouted a very cross little Miss Bossy. "I've got lots of shopping to do. I can't waste my time like this. Where do you think everybody has gone?" They were all at the zoo. And they were having a marvellous time. So were the animals. From every corner of the zoo you could hear laughs and giggles. It was a very happy place to be. "We should have days out like this more often," said Mr. Tall, and the others all agreed. "And the best thing about today," added Mr. Nosy, "is that little Miss Bossy isn't here to order us around." And it was true. Without little Miss Bossy, things were peaceful and everyone was smiling. Later that day, the zookeeper told the visitors that he had to leave, but they were welcome to stay a little longer. He left the key with Mr. Forgetful, asking him to lock the gate as he left. "You can count on me," said Mr. Forgetful proudly. Would you have left the key with Mr. Forgetful?" "I'm not sure. I would have." At the end of the day, everybody went out to the bus, which was waiting to take them back to town. They were all chatting happily about their favourite animals. Some loved the monkeys, others the lions, but they all agreed that it had been a splendid day. But Mr. Forgetful was worried. "Let me see," he said to himself, scratching his head. "Before I go, I must do something. But what is it? Knock the gate? No, that's not right at all. Lock the plate? No, that's not right either." The more he thought about it, the more muddled he became. Block the date? Stop the skate? Oh, dear me. Poor Mr. Forgetful. He went back to his friends on the bus, and just as the bus began to move, he remembered. "Lock the gate, that's it," shouted Mr. Forgetful. "Driver, who must take us back to the zoo?" And back at the zoo, what a sight! All the animals were gone. Oh no! The animals had taken over the town. The hippopotamus was delighted with the fresh, cool water and Miss Splendid's fountain. Little Miss Splendid was less delighted. And for the first time, the giraffe had found a bed that was just the right size for her. She was so pleased. Mr. Tall was less pleased. Mr. Tall said, "Get out of my bed, Giraffe." "Whatever shall we do?" cried Mr. Forgetful. "How will we ever get all the animals back to the zoo? Even if we found them all, they wouldn't do as we asked." But Mr. Clever had an idea. Quick, march! Hurry up at the back! No messing around! Keep up, keep up! Left, right, came a voice as the animals walked in perfect straight line back to the zoo. And behind them marched, yes, that's right, little Miss Bossy. Clang! As the last animal went into the zoo, Mr. Forgetful shut the gate and turned the key in the lock. The animals were all safely back inside. Now the whole zoo echoed to the shouts of little Miss Bossy. You, monkey, stop pulling silly faces. You, elephant, enough of your splashing. And you, lion, don't even think about roaring at me. Mr. Forgetful smiled and walked back towards the town. He was pleased that this time he had remembered everything. But back at the zoo, somebody was shouting, "Come back at once and let me out of this zoo." I think you know who. It was little Miss Bossy. What a funny story. Day 4. Mr. Chatterbox's Parrot. Mr. Quiet's very quiet house is surrounded by a very quiet garden. Even the winds don't blow there for fear of making a noise in the leaves of the trees. But one day, a certain someone came to live in the oak tree in Mr. Quiet's garden. Can you guess who it might be? Squawk! Wake up, wake up! I'm a pretty boy, I'm a pretty boy. A parrot. A noisy parrot was now Mr. Quiet's new neighbour. A new neighbour that meant the end of all his peace and quiet. Now, not far away lived Mr. Chatterbox. Mr. Chatterbox, who talks on and on and on, and sometimes on. What a good job you're doing, he said to the window cleaner. A really very good job, I must say. And in fact, I do say, because I have never seen anyone clean windows quite as well as you. In fact, at all as well as you. Which is to say, from morning till night, Mr. Chatterbox talks on and on about everything and anything. To anyone who will listen or won't listen. When the postman delivers the post, Mr. Chatterbox talks to him about the rain and the sun and the clouds and the wind and the time, until there is no time for the postman to deliver any more letters. On and on and on. When Mr. Chatterbox meets somebody in the street, it's just the same. Good morning, Mr. Strong. What interesting things do you have in your basket? Ah, eggs. How I love eggs. So tasty with bacon. So tasty boiled, or scrambled, or fried, or baked, or coloured, or poached. Tell me, how do you like your cakes? Boiled, or scrambled, or fried, or baked, or coloured, or poached? On and on and on and on. What a chatterbox. It was too much. Little Miss Bossy called a meeting. All those who think Mr. Chatterbox talks too much, put up your hands, ordered little Miss Bossy. Everyone at the meeting put their hands up. Some put 2 hands up. But how could they stop Mr. Chatterbox from talking so much? That was the problem, and nobody had any ideas. Do you have an idea? If you do, please tell little Miss Bossy and her friends. I may have an idea, said a very small, shy voice. I have a friend called Mr. Quiet, who hates any kind of noise, and it was little Miss Shy, and she told everyone at the meeting her idea. Can you guess what her idea might be? Hooray for little Miss Shy! Everyone cried. Hip hooray! Hip hip hooray! Little Miss Shy blushed. The next day, Mr. Quiet opened the window. He expected to hear the loud squawk of his neighbour the parrot, but there was complete silence in the garden. And why was there silence? Because the parrot was gone. At last, Mr. Quiet had peace and quiet again. And as for Mr. Chatterbox, well, he was delighted. At last he had found someone who he could talk to as much as he wanted whenever they were in the car or at home. And he talked and talked and talked and talked on and on and on and on. And if ever the parrot had had enough Mr. Chatterbox's talking, he would simply fly over and drop a cloth over his head so that, just for a change, he could speak. And on and on and on, squawked the parrot. The end. Day 5. Little Miss Tiny's Big Adventure. You may know that Little Miss Tiny is very tiny indeed. But did you know that Little Miss Tiny is so very tiny that she lives in a mouse hole? One morning she went out of her little house to buy some wool to finish the scarf she had been knitting. But when Little Miss Tiny goes shopping, she doesn't go on the bus or in a car like you or I do. Oh no, she is much too small for that. She travels by pocket. Yes, that's right, by pocket. This particular pocket belonged to a jacket which belonged to a farmer on his way to the market. Little Miss Tiny's shopping trip had begun. But first a short tractor ride. Little Miss Tiny was jumped and jiggled, bumped and buffeted in the pocket of the jacket of the farmer on the tractor. Hee hee, giggled Little Miss Tiny in the pocket of the jacket of the farmer on the tractor. What an adventure I'm having, she said to herself. I'll have so much to tell my friends about. Achoo! The farmer sneezed. The farmer sneezed a very big sneeze, and as he arrived at the market square, he pulled out his handkerchief and... What do you think happened to Little Miss Tiny? She was pulled out of the pocket, and down, down, down she fell. Poor Little Miss Tiny. She wasn't hurt, and Little Miss Tiny soon cheered up when she realized that she was in the middle of the town. Now, shall I go and do my shopping, she said to herself. 2 crumbs of bread, please, she said to the baker. But as she left the baker's, what did she meet? An enormous rat, the biggest rat of all the rats. A mean-looking rat who had his eye on her breadcrumbs, and maybe on her. But as quickly as it had arrived, it ran away, frightened by a cat. I think it's time for me to go back home, said Little Miss Tiny to herself. But the farmer had already left. Could Little Miss Tiny really walk all the way home on her little legs? Certainly not. She decided to try to get a lift from a passing car. But there were no cars on the road that night. Poor Little Miss Tiny. It wasn't long before the rain started to fall. And when you're as small as Little Miss Tiny, each raindrop is like a saucepan of water. Little Miss Tiny began to cry. If only someone would drive past, she said to herself. But no one came. Little Miss Tiny found an old tin can for shelter. She curled up inside and waited for the rain to stop. Shh, don't make any noise. Maybe Little Miss Tiny will fall asleep. Little Miss Tiny did fall asleep, and when she woke up, the rain had stopped. The cloudless sky was lit up by the moon and stars. Little Miss Tiny still felt so alone. Bounce, bounce. What do you think is making that noise? Yes, it's Mr. Bounce, bouncing and laughing as he goes. Please don't bounce on me, said a little voice. The little voice was, of course, Little Miss Tiny. And would you be kind enough to help me home? With pleasure, replied Mr. Bounce, and lifting up Little Miss Tiny, he bounced her out of the field along the road. all the way home. I never forget how you helped me, said little Miss Tiny to Mr. Bounce, as he put her down in front of the farmhouse. Bounce, bounce, bounce. Mr. Bounce bounced over the gate. I'll come back to visit next Sunday, he said, as he bounced away. Oh dear, my bread is all wet, said little Miss Tiny, but the little mice who live next door won't mind. I'll give it to them. Then she went to fetch her knitting. She hadn't even managed to get any more wool, but perhaps it didn't matter now. The scarf wasn't very long, but it was just the right size for Mr. Bounce. The perfect thank you present for her small but very bouncy friend. The end. Day 6. Mr. Bump goes on holiday. Mr. Bump was going on holiday. How very lucky. It was time for Mr. Bump to get out of bed because he had got so much to do. He had to have a shower, eat his breakfast, and pack his suitcase. There was no time to lose. Mr. Bump jumped out of bed and... Wow! Mr. Bump had wanted to be quick, but this was ridiculous. He sped across the bedroom, out of the door, down the corridor, and... Splash! Bump! He landed right in the shower, knocking the cold water tap as he went. Brrr! This was not a very good start of the day, but perhaps a nice breakfast will make all the difference. Down in the kitchen, Mr. Bump started making toast. But what was that smell? A burning smell. Oh no, Mr. Bump had burnt his toast. But before he had time to make any more toast, he heard a ring at the door. Who could be visiting Mr. Bump so early in the morning? Mr. Bump ran to open the door, and crash! A flower pot fell off the upstairs windowsill and onto his head. Oh no! Mr. Bump rubbed his sore head and looked up to see little Miss Busy standing there. I've come to bring you a little present before you go on holiday, she explained. I knitted it myself. I do hope it will bring you good luck, Mr. Bump. Very many thanks, replied Mr. Bump. I'll use it on the beach to protect me from the hot sun. Now I must rush and pack my suitcase. Hum-diddle-hum-hum, sang Mr. Bump to himself happily as he climbed the stairs. Do you notice a little problem? Uh-oh. What's happening to the scarf? Mr. Bump tripped over a loose thread from the scarf and bump, 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 bump. Mr. Bump isn't called Bump for nothing, you know. He tumbled down the stairs and landed in a dizzy heap at the bottom. I really must hurry, he said to himself. I don't want to miss my train. Mr. Bump ran as fast as he could, but he missed the bus that was going to the station. Oh, what will I do now? He asked himself. I really don't have any luck at all. But then, cheering up, he said, well, I may not have any luck, but I do have lots of ideas. And with that, he stood by the side of the road, waving at passing cars, in the hope that a friend would drive by and give him a lift. And for the first time that day, Mr. Bump had some luck. Mr. Forgetful was driving by and saw Mr. Bump waving. He stopped his car. Hello, he said. I'm sure I know you. It's Mr. Bump, Mr. Forgetful, said Mr. Bump, smiling. And who's this Mr. Forgetful you mentioned? Asked Mr. Forgetful. Why, it's you, laughed Mr. Bump. Would you be able to drive me to the station, please? Most certainly, said Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful set off backwards and drove backwards all the way to the airport. But I need to go to the station, said Mr. Bump. But it was too late. Mr. Forgetful had already driven away. Mr. Bump walked into the airport to see if anyone there could help him get to the station, but oops! He fell onto the conveyor belt, right in the middle of all the suitcases and packages. What an unlucky day. It wasn't long before Mr. Bump found himself inside a luggage compartment of the plane. Not the most comfortable seat on the plane. Do you recognize this happy traveller relaxing on a tropical island? A tropical island covered in coconut trees? Yes, of course. It's none other than Mr. Bump. And now he was finally on holiday. What could possibly go wrong? Bump. There'll be a coconut on Mr. Bump's head. The end. Day 7. Little Miss Late takes her time. It's midday. Little Miss Late was enjoying a relaxed breakfast in front of the television when there was an announcement. This is what she heard. The first 6 people to come to the supermarket will win a fabulous prize, announced the television presenter. The lucky 6 can fill their shopping trolleys with whatever they wish, without having to pay. It's completely free. How extraordinary, said Little Miss Late. I must try to win that prize, and there's not a minute to lose. What do you think Little Miss Late did next? Instead of rushing to the supermarket, finished her cereal, made herself some toast, slowly drank her tea, then she ran a deep bath with lots of bubbles, slowly climbed in, and stayed there until the water had gone completely cold. Then she carefully dried herself. But perhaps now, at last, Little Miss Late was ready to go to the supermarket to try to win the prize. No, not at all. Little Miss Late went into her bedroom, plumped her pillow, made her bed, and tidied her wardrobe. And then, in no hurry at all, Little Miss Late started to walk to the supermarket. When she arrived at the supermarket, she met Little Miss Bossy pushing a very full trolley. Always late, Little Miss Late, said Little Miss Bossy. I arrived a long time before you, and look at what I have won. If you wanted to win the prize, you should have been much quicker. Too late. Poor Little Miss Late. Not only was she too late to be one of the 6 customers, she was too late that the shop was shutting. Little Miss Late was so disappointed. The next day, Little Miss Late received a letter that cheered her up a great deal. Wonderful, she cried. I've been invited to a jumble sale. I must get ready quickly because it starts at midday. This time, I really mustn't be late. Little Miss Late spent a long time getting herself ready. This time, I'll be sure not to miss anything, she said to herself, as she finally left the house. But on the way, she met somebody. Ah, my dear Little Miss Late, began Mr. Chatterbox, who was out taking a walk and who was absolutely delighted to have met somebody he could chat to. You're looking splendid, he continued. As you always do, in fact, quite splendid, like a ray of sunshine. Ah, the sun. What a marvel the sun is. Dear Little Miss Late, did you know that 9 planets orbit around the sun? 10 according to some astronomers. And on and on and on and on and on. He talked so long that when Little Miss Late arrived at the jumble sale, Mr. Mean was shutting up. Oh no, said Little Miss Late. Please don't tell me that I'm late again. I have to tell you that you are late again, replied Mr. Mean. There's nothing left for sale. Everything has been bought, and these things are mine, he said, pointing at his wheelbarrow. Once again, Little Miss Late was very disappointed. She needed to do something to cheer herself up. So she went to the cinema. A film will give me something else to think about, she said. Ah, there's a cowboy film. I love cowboy films. Now, knowing little Miss Late, do you think she'll be in time for the film? Well, extraordinarily, for once little Miss Late was early. And if you don't believe me, listen to what the ticket man at the cinema said to her. Hello, little Miss Late. You are early. Very early, in fact. And since you are my first customer, I would like to give you a free cinema ticket. For the very first time, little Miss Late was early, and she had won something. Happily she sat herself in the middle of a big empty cinema and began to eat her ice cream and drink her fizzy drink. The cinema lights went down. Little Miss Late waited and waited and waited. After 2 or 3 hours of sitting in the dark, little Miss Late fell asleep. Do you know what woke her up? The film she came to see, which hadn't been due to play until the next morning. Silly little Miss Late. The end. Day 8. Mr. Mischief, the artist. The sky was blue, the birds were singing, and Mr. Brush was very cheerful. He was just about to start a new project. Good morning, little Miss Scatterbrain, said Mr. Brush. I've come to paint your house. Paint my house? Replied little Miss Scatterbrain. What an idea! Who asked you to come? Ah, yes, I remember. It was me. I'm going on holiday, and I'd like everything finished for when I get back. Goodbye. And with that, she left. The next morning, Mr. Brush's new painting assistant arrived. It was Mr. Mischief. Do you know Mr. Mischief? He's the one who loves nothing more than playing tricks and jokes on his friends. Would you trust him to paint your house? I don't think so. Mr. Brush showed him around little Miss Scatterbrain's house. The bathroom should be white, explained Mr. Brush. Whatever you say, boss, replied Mr. Mischief. I'm going to create an incredible work of art, giggled Mr. Mischief to himself, following Mr. Brush around the house. The kitchen walls should be white and the ceiling should be white, continued Mr. Brush. I'll do whatever you ask, said Mr. Mischief, with a very mischievous grin on his face. And Mr. Brush rushed off. He had to go and work on another painting project on the other side of town. Let's have a little fun, giggled Mr. Mischief. I'll paint little Miss Scatterbrain's bedroom orange. I know she hates that colour. And while Mr. Mischief was working, little Miss Scatterbrain was having a wonderful holiday with little Miss Neat. Did you know that I'm having my garden painted? Said a rather confused little Miss Scatterbrain. Oh, lucky you, replied little Miss Neat. There's nothing more beautiful than a neat and tidy garden. Won't it be terribly expensive? Asked Mr. Mean. In the meantime, Mr. Mischief was having the time of his life. Purple doors, he giggled. Little Miss Scatterbrain hates purple. And why should I use a paintbrush? It's so much quicker like this. Splash! Watch out! Here comes Mr. Mischief, up to mischief. A splash here, a splash there. Brightly coloured paint everywhere. But that sounds like a car outside, Mr. Mischief. Yes, little Miss Scatterbrain was back from her holiday. She was very excited to see her newly painted house. Thank you, Captain, she said to the driver. Don't forget your suitcase, little Miss Scatterbrain, smiled the driver. Thank you, Mr. Pilot, replied little Miss Scatterbrain. I do sometimes forget things. That's not a pilot, that's a taxi driver. Silly Miss Scatterbrain. Oh, but she cried as she walked into the house. Terrible, completely ruined, said a horrified Mr. Brush. Not at all, continued little Miss Scatterbrain. What I was going to say was quite the opposite. It's magnificent, very modern, a complete work of art. Oh, my kitchen is marvellous, said a delighted little Miss Scatterbrain. That's your bathroom, corrected Mr. Brush. And my bathroom is simply splendid, explained little Miss Scatterbrain as she walked into her kitchen. You are without a doubt real artists, little Miss Scatterbrain continued. Mr. Mischief, I had no idea you were so talented. I have a feeling that I should be thanking you for most of this work. Well, yes, he admitted. For the very first time, Mr. Mischief's mischief had not quite worked as he had expected. But that would soon change. I'll be telling my friend Little Miss Neat all about your excellent work, said little Miss Scatterbrain. She needs somebody to paint her garden fence. Mr. Mischief's eyes lit up mischievously. He had an idea. Oh no, I think he's going to be very naughty. The end. Day 9. Little Miss Neat cleans up. Just like every other day, Little Miss Neat had tidied her house from top to bottom. But today she was expecting a guest, so she wanted Two Pin Cottage to be as neat as 2 pins. Ring! Hello, Mr. Clumsy, said Little Miss Neat, opening the door. Do come in, but be careful of the floor polisher. But oh dear, Mr. Clumsy immediately bumped into the floor polisher, only just managing to catch the cake tin he had brought with him. I've brought you a chocolate cream cake, he said proudly, trying to open the tin. He pulled at the lid, but it wouldn't come off. He pulled again and again, and finally the lid flew off and the tin... The chocolate cream flew across the room and landed with a splat on the beautiful wallpaper that little Miss Neat was so proud of. Mr. Clumsy was so sorry for the mess he had made. Do let me help you hang new wallpaper, he said, helpfully. The thought of Mr. Clumsy inside her neat little house, with a ladder and wallpaper paste, was too much for little Miss Neat. She refused, thanked him for his offer, and hurried him out of the door as quickly as she could. For the rest of the day, little Miss Neat rubbed and scrubbed and rubbed some more. No matter how hard she tried, the marks just wouldn't come off the wallpaper. She ran to the hardware shop. I've just what you need, said the man in the shop. With Clever and Clean, the miracle cleaner, your marks will be gone in no time at all. Little Miss Neat rubbed and scrubbed. She scrubbed and she rubbed all through the night. But it was no good. Even with Clever Clean, the miracle cleaner, she couldn't get rid of the chocolatey marks. Little Miss Neat didn't know what to do. The next morning she rang Mr. Bossy. Please can you come as quickly as possible, she said. I spent all night trying to clean the marks that Mr. Clumsy made on my walls, but I can't get rid of them. As soon as Mr. Bossy arrived, little Miss Neat showed him the terrible marks on the wall. But your wallpaper is perfect, said an astonished Mr. Bossy. I've never seen such clean wallpaper. You should be awarded a silver medal for cleanliness. And I, of course, would get the gold. But what about all those marks? Exclaimed little Miss Neat. All over the walls. If you wouldn't mind showing me your glasses for a moment, asked Mr. Bossy. Can you see what the problem was with little Miss Neat's glasses? There's chocolate on her glasses, not on the wall. All the marks have gone, said little Miss Neat, as she took off her glasses. It's quite extraordinary. Now, all that little Miss Neat could see were the pretty flowers on her wallpaper, and every last flower was perfectly clean. She put on her glasses again, and once more the wallpaper was covered in chocolatey marks. Then suddenly, red with embarrassment, she realized her mistake and cried, I see, it's my glasses that are dirty, not the walls. Oh, to think that I hadn't cleaned my glasses. How terrible! Just then, They heard a ring. There was somebody at the door. That somebody was Mr. Clumsy, carrying a bunch of flowers. "Hello, little Miss Neat," he said. "I've come to say sorry for the terrible clumsiness yesterday." "Do come in," said little Miss Neat kindly. "I'll put those pretty flowers in a nice clean vase with perfectly clear water and give you a very neat slice of cake." But no sooner had Mr. Clumsy walked in the door than he stepped into the bucket that little Miss Neat had been using for her cleaning. The water splashed all over little Miss Neat and Mr. Fussy. They were soaked from head to toe. "Back to work, little Miss Neat," laughed Mr. Fussy. "Oh, I am so terribly sorry," said Mr. Clumsy. "I'm starting to get used to your clumsiness, Mr. Clumsy," giggled little Miss Neat. "In fact, I must thank you. My glasses are now perfectly clean." The end. Day 10. Mr. Small's Big Dream. Can you see the lights and hear the music? The fair has come to town. And on this beautiful spring morning, Mr. Small, little Miss Greedy, Mr. Skinny, and Mr. Busy were on their way to the fair. "If you want to see the most amazing things, follow me," cried Mr. Small. "There's an animal trainer who gets wild animals to perform tricks right before your very eyes. Incredible." But Mr. Small's friends were much more interested in the bumper cars. "Move out of the way, Mr. Small," called out Mr. Busy as he sped past. "This isn't for small people like you." Because, of course, Mr. Small is so very small, and the bumper cars are just too big for him. They're too fast, too noisy, and most definitely too big. Poor Mr. Small. Candy floss for sale," came the call, and immediately everyone hurried towards the man with a candy floss cart. Mr. Small got pushed this way and that by the crowd. "A large candy floss for me, please," said little Miss Greedy greedily. "Me first. I'm terribly hungry," said Mr. Rush. "I'll have a candy floss with 2 sticks so that I can hold it better," said Mr. Clumsy. "Please could I have a small candy floss?" asked Mr. Small in his very small voice, but nobody heard him. Poor Mr. Small. A little further along, a man was calling out to the crowd, roll up, ladies and gentlemen. Is there anyone who dares to challenge the strongest man in the world? He's a marvel, he's a giant. See for yourselves. Roll up, roll up." "What are you waiting for, Mr. Busy?" teased little Miss Greedy. "Aren't you going to challenge the strongest man in the world?" "I'm far too busy," replied Mr. Busy hurriedly. "Perhaps we should send Mr. Small." This was, of course, made everyone laugh. Everyone except Mr. Small, who tried to make himself even smaller than usual. Poor Mr. Small. But, much to the relief of Mr. Small, his friends moved away from the strongest man in the world and went into the Hall of Mirrors. Being a fair, the mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors were no ordinary mirrors, of course, as Mr. Skinny soon found out. He's skinny and he's big. And as for Mr. Small, well, he was completely transformed. And as he stared at the enormous reflection, he began to dream about how different life could be if only he wasn't so small. "Bumper cars aren't for small people like you, Mr. Busy," he imagined himself saying as he crashed into a very small Mr. Busy. "Nobody is too strong for me," he imagined himself saying to the not-so-strongest man in the world. But little Miss Greedy's voice interrupted his daydream. "Mr. Small, don't you want to take us to see the animal trainer?" she asked. "Oh, yes," replied Mr. Small. 4 tickets, please." "I'm sorry," replied the ticket seller, but there's no show today. The animal trainer is injured." "I can take his place," replied Mr. Small boldly. "I know this show very well. I've seen it many times." There was a drum roll, and Mr. Small stepped onto the stage. Was Mr. Small, who was so very small, really going to stand face to face with a wild animal? Little Miss Greedy, for one, was quite sure that Mr. Small had gone completely, stark, raving mad. Hop, hop, hop! A frog! A little green frog! Yes, Mr. Small was standing face to face with a wild animal, a small, green, wild animal. The show was a huge success, and Mr. Small was delighted. He had always wanted to be a wild animal trainer. At last his dream had come true. A round of applause for Mr. Small, the greatest frog trainer in the whole world, announced the ticket seller. "Hip, hip, hooray!" cried Mr. Small's friends and the rest of the audience. And the last I heard of Mr. Small was that he had plans to open a flea circus. But that's another story. I'd like to read that story about Mr. Small's flea circus. Day 11. Little Miss Lucky's friend. It was Sunday, and Little Miss Lucky had invited Little Miss Bossy, Mr. Snooty, and Mr. Grumble to her house. What do you think she had invited them for? For lunch, perhaps? Or for tea? Or to relax in her pretty garden? No. If Little Miss Lucky invited Little Miss Bossy, Mr. Snooty, and Mr. Grumble for anything, it was to play a board game. Little Miss Lucky is always incredibly lucky when it comes to playing board games, so she is always incredibly keen to play. "A one again?" complained Mr. Grumble, after he had thrown the dice. "Me too," cried Little Miss Bossy. "That's the 5th time that's happened to me." "A one? A one again? This is a terrible game," said Mr. Snooty rudely. But not everyone was rolling ones. Watch Little Miss Lucky. 6. A 6. Little Miss Lucky had won the game. It must have been her lucky day. The friends were most annoyed, and so they decided to try a different game in the garden. A game of skittles. "Little Miss Lucky can start," said Mr. Snooty. "Then she'll be out first." Little Miss Lucky was just about to throw the ball when a beautiful, colourful butterfly flew by. Little Miss Lucky was looking at the butterfly instead of looking at the skittles. Whoosh! She threw the ball in completely the wrong direction. Bonk! Little Miss Lucky's ball hit a tree, bounced off it, and knocked down every last skittle. She had won again. Little Miss Lucky's friends had had enough. They all went home complaining that Little Miss Lucky's games were silly. Poor Little Miss Lucky was very sad to see them leave so soon. "Nobody will ever play with me," she told Mr. Bump, who was passing by. "Everyone says I'm just too lucky." "Too lucky?" exclaimed Mr. Bump. "That can't be right. Perhaps you'll like to play with me. But before we do, let's take a walk down the street." The road seemed to be full of dangers for Mr. Bump. If there is ever something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he's sure to bump into it. Poor Mr. Bump. And if there's anything to fall into, Mr. Bump is sure to fall into it. Mr. Bump didn't seem to have any luck at all. "How is it possible that you are so unlucky?" said Little Miss Lucky, shocked by all his accidents that day. "It's quite extraordinary. You didn't break anything, I hope?" "No," said Mr. Bump. "No more than normal, at least. Now for a game of skittles." Mr. Bump picked up a ball. He did a little run up, a turn, and threw the ball as hard as he could. The ball took off at an incredible speed, bouncing off a tree trunk. Bonk! And hit Mr. Bump on the head, knocking him right into the Skittles. Wham! The Skittles were knocked down in one clean sweep. "Good shot!" cried little Miss Lucky. "Congratulations, Mr. Bump!" Little Miss Lucky was delighted. She had found a friend to play games with at last. "Well done, Mr. Bump. Some of my good luck must have rubbed off on you," said little Miss Lucky, as Mr. Bump threw another 6, so hard that it bumped him and the dice into the corner of the room. "I hope some of her good luck will rub off on you too." The end. Day 12. Mr. Clever flies a kite. One blustery day, Mr. Clever called a little Miss Neat's house. "What perfect weather for flying a kite," he said to her. "Won't you join me for the kite flying on Windy Hill? You can tidy up your garden later." After much persuasion, little Miss Neat agreed. She ran inside to find her kite. As you can imagine, her kite was perfectly ironed and neatly folded. Such a perfectly neat kite could only belong to little Miss Neat. "I'm so very, very clever to have built this clever kite for myself," boasted Mr. Clever. "I've made it out of a map so that we'll never get lost. How very clever I am." Lots of friends had gathered on Windy Hill. Mr. Greedy had the most delicious-looking kites. How greedy! Mr. Mean had made his kite out of an old vest. How mean! Mr. Muddle had got a terrible tangled in his kite. What a muddle! Not very clever at all, laughed Mr. Clever. I'm so very much more clever than that. Everyone had beautiful kites. Everyone except Mr. Forgetful. He had forgotten his. How forgetful! It wasn't long before the wind got even stronger. The kites flew wildly in the sky and soon got tangled up. Mr. Tall came to the rescue and worked hard to untangle them. Mr. Clever was far too clever to let his kite get in a tangle. Suddenly there was a shout. "Help!" Poor little Miss Tiny. She was so small and light that she had been blown away with her kite. "Help me! Help me!" Mr. Small rushed to her rescue, but he was so small and light that his feet were lifted off the ground, and he was lifted right into the air with little Miss Tiny. Phew, thank goodness that Mr. Tall was there. Just then, Mr. Tickle arrived. Mr. Tickle was looking for someone to tickle. Mr. Tickle was looking for anyone to tickle. Tickle, tickle, tickle. It was not at all easy to fly a kite while you are being tickled. "I am so very, very clever," said Mr. Clever proudly. "I have an excellent idea. Let's have lunch. And Mr. Tickle can look after the kites." So many! After holding all the kites, Mr. Tickle was so tired he could hardly lift his arms. He went back home exhausted, with only enough strength for, can you guess, Clever Clogs? That's right, a tiny tickle for you. Tickle, tickle, tickle. What a cool story. Day 13. Little Miss Helpful at the Fair. Little Miss Helpful was spending the day at the fair. "I expect you like fairs, don't you?" Little Miss Helpful did. "There are so many fun things to do at the fair." But what Little Miss Helpful liked to do best of all was to help other people. So she looked around the fair for someone who might need her help. She stopped by Mr. Fussy, the candy floss seller. he had a question for her. "I need to ask for your help, Little Miss Helpful. Could you look after my store for a while? I completely forgot to change my goldfish's water this morning," he said, "and that will never do." "Don't worry," said Little Miss Helpful. "I'm happy to help." A moment later, Little Miss Splendid arrived. She had made a special effort for the fair and was looking particularly splendid. "Good morning, Little Miss Helpful," she said. "I wish to buy a candy floss to match the colour of my hat. It's such a stylish hat, don't you agree?" "Happy to help," said Little Miss Helpful. She pressed the button to switch the candy floss machine on. Brrr! The candy floss grew and grew and grew like a big pink cloud. But the cloud was getting too big for the machine. It puffed over the edges and Little Miss Splendid found herself completely covered in sticky pink candy floss. She was not pleased. Her hat was ruined. She was not pleased at all. "Oh, I'm so terribly sorry," said Little Miss Helpful, and in a terrible state of confusion she ran away, leaving poor Little Miss Splendid more stuck up than ever before. Next, Little Miss Helpful went to the shooting gallery. Little Miss Helpful at the shooting gallery? That doesn't sound like a very good idea, does it? I think there might be another problem before too long. But at that moment, Little Miss Helpful noticed a very strange sight indeed. Mr. Lazy, the balloon seller, had fallen asleep. Mr. Lazy had not only fallen asleep, but he had also floated up into the sky, no doubt dreaming beautiful blue sky dreams. But his dreams would soon be over. Little Miss Helpful didn't hesitate for a second. She picked up the air rifle and pow, pow, pow! Pop, pop, pop! One by one, Mr. Lazy's colourful balloons popped. Pop, pop, pop! For once, Mr. Lazy was wide awake. There was a big crash. Mr. Lazy had fallen to the ground, thanks to the help of Little Miss Helpful. She had only wanted to help, but look what had happened. Poor Mr. Lazy went home, rubbing his poor bruised bottom. Oh no! To cheer herself up, Little Miss Helpful went to the food store. All the best cooks in town had prepared food for the fair. "Go and get some bowls and cups, Little Miss Helpful," ordered Little Miss Bossy. "And I hope that, for once, you won't cause any trouble." But of course Little Miss Helpful wanted to be as helpful as she possibly could, so she decided to carry as many bowls and cups as she possibly could. Well, couldn't, in fact. The huge pile of cups and bowls wobbled this way and that. It was tipping dangerously. "Where are those bowls?" asked Little Miss Bossy impatiently. "What on earth is going on? I didn't ask you to do a little dance as well." Poor Little Miss Helpful was finding it so hard to keep her balance. She was dancing this way and that, trying to keep everything from landing in a big heap on the floor. But alas, 1 bowl, 2 bowls, 10 bowls, all the bowls and cups tumbled down around Little Miss Bossy and broke into 1,000 pieces. And who do you think landed in the middle of the table with all the food? Little Miss Helpful, of course. "Yum! That's the best potato salad I've ever tasted," said Little Miss Helpful. "You must have given me the recipe." Everyone burst out laughing, even Little Miss Bossy. And what do you think was the most popular attraction at the fair that day? Why, Little Miss Helpful's Cups and Bowls dancing act, of course. The end. Day 14. Mr. Nonsense isn't himself. On this particular morning, the streets were empty, strangely empty. "I wonder why," said Little Miss Scatterbrain to herself. Then she saw Little Miss Late. "Why are the streets so empty, Little Miss Late?" she asked. "And why are you running?" "Why, today is the competition for the Nonsense Cup," she said. "Had you forgotten? They're about to announce the winner of the silliest idea." "Oh, how forgetful of me! replied little Miss Scatterbrain. Nonsense Land. A very strange place indeed, with some very strange inhabitants. And it is in Nonsense Land, at the top of a tree, that Mr. Nonsense lives. If you were to take a walk in Nonsense Land, you would be astonishingly astonished. In Nonsense Land, they play strange games of tennis, on strange tennis courts, with strange rackets. On this morning, Mr. Nonsense was playing with Mr. Silly and little Miss Dotty. As for the fourth player, it was a pig. Yes, a very cute pink pig. Donk! Poor Mr. Nonsense. A tennis ball hit him on the nose. Mr. Nonsense was knocked out. His friends rushed to help him. They tried to get him to talk, but with no luck. Would Mr. Nonsense ever be the same again? This is terrible, cried little Miss Dotty. We must do something to help poor Mr. Nonsense. Meanwhile, the competition for the Nonsense Cup had begun. One by one, contestants amazed the crowd with their silly ideas. A helmet with wings. How silly. And what do you have there, Mr. Lazy? Asked little Miss Brainy. This, said Mr. Lazy sleepily, is an alarm clock with no numbers, no hands. Ah, at last, I can sleep for as long as I like. This alarm clock will never go off. How silly. At last, Mr. Nonsense had come around. How are you feeling, Mr. Nonsense? Asked Mr. Silly anxiously. Why are you calling me Mr. Nonsense? Said Mr. Nonsense. That's not my name. But of course it's your name, said little Miss Dotty. And up there is your house. My house, he said, much astonished. Only birds live in trees. Mr. Nonsense really wasn't himself at all. Back at the competition, the contestants took it in turns to take to the stage. The crowd clapped and clapped when they saw Mr. Bouncer's idea. It was egg juggling. What a silly idea. You may not be surprised to hear Mr. Nonsense didn't want to have anything to do with such a silly competition. But little Miss Dotty pushed him onto the stage, hoping it might help him remember who he was. Stop calling me Mr. Nonsense, complained Mr. Nonsense. I don't even know who you are, and you don't have the right to... Welcome, Mr. Nonsense, said little Miss Brainy. Imagine that this year, as every other year, you will have found a splendidly silly idea. But I'm not Mr. Nonsense, protested Mr. Nonsense, to amaze little Miss Brainy. Little Miss Dotty was worried. Mr. Nonsense's bump on the head had really changed him. At that moment, Mr. Nonsense was declared the winner of the Nonsense Club. Have you guessed why? It was because the more Mr. Nonsense said he wasn't Mr. Nonsense, the more the judges loved what they thought was the silliest idea yet. Hip hip hooray! Cried the crowd. Mr. Bounce joined in the celebration by juggling higher and higher. But Mr. Bounce threw an egg so high that he just couldn't catch it and, donk, the egg hit Mr. Nonsense on the nose. How nice to see you, little Miss Dotty, smiled Mr. Nonsense. But I'm feeling rather hungry. Let's go eat a strawberry jam and mustard omelette. Thank goodness, smiled little Miss Dotty. You're back to your usual self. And ever since this day, can you guess what Mr. Nonsense did when he played tennis? He wears a helmet, of course, with wings. The end. Day 15. Little Miss Stubborn and the Unexpected Holiday. On this particular day, Little Miss Stubborn had invited Little Miss Brainy and Mr. Greedy round for a hot chocolate. But Little Miss Brainy and Little Miss Stubborn couldn't agree on anything. Not on how hot the hot chocolate should be, nor how chocolatey the hot chocolate should be, or even what cold hot chocolate should be called. All I know is that this hot chocolate is extremely good, said Mr. Greedy between mouthfuls. Perhaps we should change the subject. Does anybody know how big Little Island is? But of course, once again, Little Miss Brainy and Little Miss Stubborn couldn't agree. Little Miss Stubborn was sure that it was 1 metre long and 2 metres wide. Little Miss Brainy was sure that it was 2 metres long and 1 metre wide. If you don't believe me, then you'll have to go there yourself and check, said Little Miss Brainy crossly. So what do you think Little Miss Stubborn did next? She went there to check, of course. Little Miss Stubborn isn't called Little Miss Stubborn for nothing. Look, she's getting on an airplane. Are we at Little Island? Asked Little Miss Stubborn as the plane landed. No, Little Miss Stubborn, replied the pilot. The island you're looking for is over there. You'll have to get to it by boat. Little Miss Stubborn found a sailor and asked him if he could take her to the island, but he refused because a storm was on its way. That didn't stop Little Miss Stubborn, of course. There won't be a storm, she said. I'd like to buy your boat. But the sailor was right. There was a storm. A big storm. The waves grew larger and larger. They crashed against the sides of Little Miss Stubborn's small boat until finally one particularly large wave tipped the boat over completely, and Little Miss Stubborn was thrown into the sea. Little Miss Stubborn swam with all her might until, eventually, exhausted, she collapsed onto the sand of Little Island. She fell into a deep sleep, but she woke up to a surprise. You'll never guess what it was. Little Miss Tiny, said Little Miss Stubborn. What a surprise! What are you doing here? I come to Little Island every year for a little holiday, replied Little Miss Tiny. Are you on holiday as well? But Little Miss Stubborn didn't have time to chat. How tall are you? She asked rather rudely. 5 centimetres exactly, replied Little Miss Tiny, surprised. Little Miss Stubborn had lost her tape measure in the storm, but that wasn't going to stop her. She had the perfect way to measure the island. 5 plus 5, that's 10. Plus 5, it's 15. And so on until Little Miss Tiny was quite dizzy. Just as I thought, Little Island's exactly 1 metre long and 2 metres wide, said Little Miss Stubborn triumphantly. And without explaining her strange behaviour to Little Miss Tiny, she called out a passing boat and hurried home, leaving Little Miss Tiny to enjoy her little holiday in peace. 1 metre long, 2 metres wide, said Little Miss Stubborn, much later that night to a sleepy Little Miss Brainy, who had forgotten all about their disagreement. A few days later, Little Miss Brainy invited Little Miss Stubborn round for tea. Mr. Greedy was also invited, and he had already finished all the biscuits by the time the others had sat down at the table. There's a question written here on the biscuit tin, he said, licking the last crumbs from his fingers. How far is it from Earth to the moon? 384,400 kilometres, said Little Miss Brainy without a second thought. How can you be so sure? Asked Little Miss Stubborn. It's written in all the books, replied Little Miss Brainy. But, she added mischievously, if you don't believe me, do check yourself. Little Miss Stubborn took a deep breath. Very well, then, I will, she said stubbornly. And off she went to call her friend Little Miss Tiny. The end. Day 16. Mr. Tall and the Big Surprise. Every morning, Mr. Tall wakes up in a bad mood. Can you guess why? Because his legs are too long. How unfortunate to be so very tall, he mutters to himself, looking down at his long legs, making a mountain under the bedclothes. Can you imagine the problems he has when he goes for a swim in Mr. Greedy's pool? Splash and crash. It's just not easy with such long legs. He also has problems at the cinema. He has to buy several tickets because his legs take up so many seats. On this particular day, Mr. Tall had bought 5 tickets and was just settling down to watch a film when he heard a small voice. "Please could you move a little? I can't see the screen." He turned, and there behind him was little Miss Tiny. She looked so small in her enormous seat, and all of a sudden Mr. Tall felt extremely sad that he was spoiling the film for her. He was so sad that he left the cinema with tears rolling down his cheeks. It just so happened that little Miss Magic was passing. Being Magic, she already knew why Mr. Tall was sad. She spoke some magic words. The next morning, for the very first time, Mr. Tall woke up and stretched his legs. "Short legs! It's a miracle!" he cried. Delighted, Mr. Tall rushed off to show his friends his new short legs. "Good morning, Mr. Strong," said the no longer tall Mr. Tall. "Are you planning to eat all those eggs?" "My little man," replied Mr. Strong, "these eggs are for making a cake." And off he hurried, without having recognized Mr. Tall at all. Little Miss Somersault was also in too much of a rush to realize that the no longer tall person was in fact Mr. Tall. She was also rushing off to make a cake. With a ladder? What a strange way to make a cake. Mr. Tall couldn't help wondering why everyone was making cakes. But luckily for a moment, along came little Miss Chatterbox. She was more than happy to stop and chat and chat and chat and chat about. And so they're all busy getting a big birthday surprise ready for Mr. Tall, she finished, quite out of breath. "A surprise? For me?" cried Mr. Tall, delighted. "No, not for you," explained little Miss Chatterbox, for once almost lost for words. "For Mr. Tall." Of course, making a birthday cake for Mr. Tall isn't easy. His friends had used mountains of eggs, sacks of flour, buckets of cream, a bar full of icing, and a whole tree of cherries. Placing on top of the long ladder, little Miss Somersault was putting the last of the candles onto the cake. At that moment, Mr. Tall arrived at the party. Everyone gave him a strange look. Nobody knew who this small, round person was. "It's me," he announced, "Mr. Tall." But nobody believed him. Well, would you? 1, 2, 3, tall, said a voice from high above their heads. Everyone looked up, and there, in a shower of stars, was little Miss Magic, and beneath her, Mr. Tall was tall once again. "Happy birthday, Mr. Tall," cheered everyone as Mr. Tall began to cut his delicious-looking and very tall cake. But there was another surprise to come, a bed that was just the right size for Mr. Tall. What a wonderful birthday present! Mr. Tall yawned, stretched out his long legs, and tested his new bed. Perfect. Mr. Tall thanked his friends, and everyone joined in the party. There was more cake than even Mr. Greedy could eat, and balloons for everyone, from the tallest to the very smallest. "Next time you go to the cinema, just don't sit in front of me," giggled little Miss Tiny. The end. Day 17. Little Miss Wise's winning walk. Do you know anyone as wise as little Miss Wise? I imagine not. Little Miss Wise is as wise and sensible, or sensible and wise if you prefer, as anyone I know. Every morning, little Miss Wise brushes her teeth, being careful to use exactly the right amount of toothpaste. Not a millimeter too much, not a millimeter too small. And every morning little Miss Wise has a very wise and sensible breakfast in her kitchen. Do you think that she puts lots of jam on her slice of toast? Not at all. A small amount of jam is wise and sensible. And every morning little Miss Wise takes a walk. Not too short, not too long, not too fast, not too slow. She also always goes the same way, so that there is no risk of her getting lost. And it's while she was on one of those morning walks that she met 4 of her friends. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Good morning, little Miss Wise," said Mr. Bump. "Come with us to see little Miss Star. We're going to have a skateboarding race." "A skateboarding race?" exclaimed little Miss Wise. "Are you sure that it is a sport that will suit you, Mr. Bump?" she asked wisely. "Well, enjoy yourselves," she added, "but I prefer to walk. I find it much less dangerous." And she continued on her way. Not long after, the competitors in the race were ready at the starting line. Little Miss Star was just about to start the race when she noticed that someone was missing. Can you spot who is missing? Yes, Mr. Greedy. But they didn't have time to wait for him. On your marks, get set, go! Cried little Miss Star. Mr. Bump's skateboard was off at full speed, and its poor owner soon found himself wobbling all over the place. He found it very difficult indeed to stay on his board. So difficult, in fact, that the skateboard continued the race without its owner. Whee! And landed just behind little Miss Wise, as she wisely and sensibly continued with her walk. The skateboard continued the race, with a terrified little Miss Wise on board. "Help me!" she cried, as she hurtled down a hill at full speed. Mr. Busy was in the lead, and he was already at the slalom. "Tra-la-la," he sang, as he waved between the obstacles with great ease and at great speed. "I'm sure to win." Wah! Little Miss Wise, still perched on the skateboard, was the next to attempt the slalom. Wisely, she closed her eyes and crossed the finish line with a bump, taking Mr. Greedy's finishing flag with her, and landed right in the middle of the end of the race faced, or what was left of it. Mr. Greedy had been there earlier, you see. "Little Miss Wise has won the skateboarding race," announced little Miss Star. All the friends danced to celebrate little Miss Wise's victory, although not everyone. Look carefully. Somebody seems to be missing. Yes, little Miss Somersault was not in the mood for celebrating. She was feeling rather cross because she won every race. And since then, do you think little Miss Wise takes the skateboard with her on her morning walk? Most certainly not. But she does wear a helmet and knee pads, just in case. The end. Day 18. Mr. Strong looks for a job. Mr. Strong was the strongest person you've ever met. But he had a problem. He was too strong for any job. If he washed a car, all the paint would rub off. If he painted the house would fall down. He was much too strong. But that morning Mr. Strong had at last found a job that sounded just right for him. Zookeeper. And he could start the next week. On Monday, Mr. Strong was to put in charge of cleaning the monkey cage. He scrubbed and rubbed and brushed some more. Hee-hee, the monkeys giggled as they watched him work. But he brushed so hard that, snap, the handle of the brush broke. "Whoops," said Mr. Strong. Hee-hee, the monkeys laughed more than ever. Tuesday, Mr. Strong was put in charge of feeding the penguins. He drove the tractor straight into the water. "Sorry," called Mr. Strong to the surprised penguins. On Wednesday, Mr. Strong was put in charge of the panda. Do you think he used the door to get into the cage? Not at all. He stretched the bars of the cage and simply walked straight in. Easy. But seeing his chance, the panda ran towards the gap in the bars and, with a big smile on his face, he escaped. "Sorry," said Mr. Strong. On Thursday, Mr. Strong was not put in charge of any animals. He was put in charge of selling ice creams. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, the ice cream corners were small. The ice cream corners were not very strong. Ice cream corners are small. The ice cream corners are not very strong. Whoops. "I'm sorry," said Mr. Strong to his sticky customers. Ice cream on their faces. Oh no. On Friday, Mr. Strong was put in charge of the washing up. But the plates didn't last long. Crash. "Oh dear, I can't do anything right," said Mr. Strong. Without a doubt, Mr. Strong was just too strong. Perhaps the zoo wasn't the place for him. But on Sunday, Mr. Strong was given a job that, for once, really used his strength, lifting the baby elephant into the bath. Like all babies, the elephant loved taking a bath, and he even had a rubber duck to play with. How silly. The head zookeeper was delighted. "Well done, Mr. Strong. This job is perfect for you. I have an idea." Now Mr. Strong comes to the zoo every Saturday to bath the baby elephant, and sometimes even the mummy and daddy elephants. But juggling the elephants is strictly forbidden. The end. Day 19. Little Miss Magic to the rescue. Little Miss Magic was out for her daily walk when she met Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong seemed worried, very worried indeed. "Good morning, Mr. Strong," said little Miss Magic. "Is something the matter?" "Indeed it is," sighed Mr. Strong. "I'm so strong that I can't help breaking everything I touch. I just went to open the gate and, without any effort at all, it came off in my hand. I just wish I wasn't so strong." "Oh, that's no good at all," said little Miss Magic kindly. "I'm going to help you. Weak," she commanded. Little Miss Magic isn't called Little Miss Magic for nothing, you know. When Little Miss Magic tells something to do something, it does it. Mr. Strong only just had the strength to lift his feet to get himself back home. Little Miss Magic continued with her walk, but it wasn't long before she met Mr. Small, who was jumping up and down over and over again. "Good morning, Mr. Small," said little Miss Magic. "Is something the matter?" "I've had enough," said Mr. Small, just as soon as he got his breath back. "I'm so small that I can never see what's going on. I always have to climb up walls or balance on chairs and ladders. Oh, I wish I was taller." It will come as no surprise to learn that this gave little Miss Magic an idea. She was sure that if she used her magic on Mr. Small, she would be able to cheer him up. "Tall," she said. And then, do you know what happened? Well, Mr. Small's legs began to grow and grow and grow until he looked more like Mr. Tall than Mr. Small. He was delighted. The world looked so beautiful from such a great height. Continuing with her walk, little Miss Magic met Mr. Forgetful. "Good morning, Mr. Forgetful," said little Miss Magic. "How are you?" "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" he replied. "But I believe you just asked me a question, and I've already forgotten it. Oh, I've had enough of being so forgetful. I wish I could remember all the things I've got to do. It could change my life." Poor Mr. Forgetful couldn't remember anything at all. And so once again little Miss Magic decided to help. "Remember," she cried. And straight away Mr. Forgetful remembered that he had forgotten to switch the television off, and he had left all his shopping at the market, and that his friends were coming to his house for lunch. Mr. Forgetful's head had never been so full, and he rushed off to do all the things he had forgotten, which was a lot. "Help, help!" came a voice from further up the lane. Little Miss Magic ran towards the shouts, and there she found Mr. Greedy, stuck in his own garden gate because he had been so greedy that morning. "Little Miss Magic, please help me," he cried. "I don't know what to do. I can't stop eating. And the more I eat, the fatter I become. I'm getting fatter and fatter. I can't even fit through my own garden gate anymore. And yesterday I broke Mr. Slow's armchair when I sat in it. I wish I was thin." You can imagine what happened next. Quite right. Little Miss Magic worked her magic, and just look at what happened. Mr. Greedy became quite a different shape altogether. Not at all his old self. And that was the end of Little Miss Magic's good deeds for the day. A few days later, Little Miss Magic was eating her breakfast when, ding dong! Who do you think was at Little Miss Magic's door? It was 4 very miserable visitors. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Oh, Little Miss Magic," they pleaded, "please can you change us back to how we used to be? Our lives have changed, but now we're sad." Mr. Strong was so weak that he could barely lift his arms. Mr. Small was so tall he kept bumping his head wherever he went. Mr. Forgetful's head was so full of things he had to do that he could no longer sleep. And as for Mr. Greedy, he had completely lost his appetite. Something had to be done. Little Miss Magic didn't need to think twice about using her magic, and soon she put all her friends back to normal again. Mr. Strong was strong once again. Mr. Small was as small can be once again. Mr. Forgetful immediately forgot all the things he had to do, and Mr. Greedy's tummy once again almost touched his toes. But most importantly at all, they were all smiling again. They thanked Little Miss Magic and went on their way. Once the door had shut behind them, an air of magic still hung in the house of Little Miss Magic. Everything had been put back to how it should be. Everyone had found their old self and was very, very happy. Ding dong! Oh, but there was somebody at the door. Little Miss Magic opened the door, and there stood Mr. Forgetful, looking most perplexed. "How can I help you, Mr. Forgetful?" asked Little Miss Magic kindly. I'm not entirely certain," he said. I'm so forgetful. Perhaps you invited me to tea, or asked me to take a walk with you, or perhaps I was going to help you with your shopping?" Little Miss Magic smiled. "Tea and cake," she said, and she invited Mr. Forgetful in for a delicious afternoon tea. The best tea he could ever remember. The end. Day 20. Mr. Silly and the Silly Secret. Mr. Silly lives in a silly house. Quite the silliest looking house you have ever seen. Well, have you ever seen a sillier looking house? But then Mr. Silly is very silly, so it's hardly surprising that he lives in such a silly house. On this particular day, Mr. Silly decided to make the most of the good weather and go out for the day. He got to the bus stop, but he kept walking. Nothing strange about that, I hear you say. He was in the mood for a walk. But no, not at all. Mr. Silly had decided to wait for the bus a little further along by a lamppost. But do you know what happens when you wait for a bus by a lamppost? That's right, the bus doesn't stop. How silly of Mr. Silly. If you want to take the bus, called the bus driver, you must wait at the bus stop like everyone else. But Mr. Silly didn't want to be like everyone else. He continued with his walk. He had an idea. A few days later, little Miss Helpful was passing Mr. Silly's house when she heard strange noises coming from inside his shed. "Good morning, Mr. Silly," she called. "Can I help you?" "If you want to," replied Mr. Silly. Poor little Miss Helpful. She came out of the shed covered in sticky black oil. "Yuck!" she cried. What could Mr. Silly be up to in his shed? It was a mystery. The next day Mr. Silly was so busy in his shed that he didn't hear Mr. Nosy coming along. Mr. Nosy was always poking his nose into other people's business, so he couldn't resist taking a peek into Mr. Silly's shed. Bang! Oh! Mr. Nosy's nose got shut in the door. "I'm sorry," said Mr. Silly. "Let me make it up to you. I'll show you my secret." Would you like to know what Mr. Silly's secret was? Mr. Silly had made himself a car, but not at all like anyone else's car. It was extremely tall, bath-shaped car. Mr. Silly could see for miles around. What a silly car. "A car that you can take a bath in," laughed Mr. Funny. How funny. From high up in his car, Mr. Silly could always find a parking space, and the car could go up and down to let Mr. Silly in and out. One day Mr. Silly was shopping. Snow began to fall. Soon everything was covered in a thick blanket of crisp white snow. All the cars were covered and couldn't be moved, all except Mr. Silly's. Thanks to his tall car, Mr. Silly was the only person who was able to drive away. On the way, he met his friends waiting for the bus. "Brr. Let me give you a lift," called Mr. Silly. "Hooray for Mr. Silly!" cried all his friends. "So much more fun than the bus," laughed Mr. Funny. The next day all the newspapers told the story of Mr. Silly's amazing invention. Now everyone wanted a car like Mr. Silly's. "I think," said Mr. Silly to himself, "that I'll build a jellycopter next." What? Or something even sillier. What do you think that could be? Oh, I don't know. What's sillier than a jellycopter? The end. Day 21. Little Miss Contrary and the Confused Guest. Little Miss Wise had been invited to spend the weekend with Little Miss Contrary. She was very excited. It was the first time she had ever visited her. When Little Miss Wise arrived, she could hardly hide her surprise. She had never seen a house quite like Little Miss Contrary's house. Have you ever seen a house like that before? I'm sure I haven't. Sideways. "Goodbye," said Little Miss Contrary, opening the door. "Do come out and have a drink," she continued, letting Little Miss Wise in. Poor Little Miss Wise was terribly confused. "And just look at the house inside. Have you ever seen anything like it? Everything's upside down." Little Miss Contrary poured her friend a glass of sweets. "I do hope you don't like it," she smiled. Poor Little Miss Wise was more confused than ever. A little later they went for a walk in the garden. Little Miss Wise thought she must be dreaming. The trees were grown upside down and the grass was blue. "What a horrible day," said Little Miss Contrary, as the sun shone down on her umbrella. Of course you and I know that Little Miss Contrary lives in Model Land. And in Model Land, the worms live in trees. How silly. And in Model Land, the birds live in holes in the ground. Just then, it started to rain. Little Miss Contrary closed her umbrella. What lovely weather we're having, she said. Little Miss Wise began to wonder if Little Miss Country was playing a trick on her. Back at the house, Little Miss Wise was fed up. That's enough teasing, she said crossly. I'm tired. I think I'd like to go to bed now. But before you do, said Little Miss Country, put your hat under the Christmas tree so that Father Christmas knows that you've been here and he will leave you a present. A Christmas tree? Father Christmas? In the middle of summer? This was too much for Little Miss Wise, and she hurried off to bed. Little Miss Country, who had a lovely day with her friend, went to bed and slept well, with her alarm clock ringing in her ears. But with all that noise, somebody didn't sleep well that night. Can you guess who? That's right, poor Little Miss Wise. What a terrible noise, and what a terribly confusing day, she grumbled to herself. I don't understand it at all. The next morning. Good night, said Little Miss Country. You look so fresh and well rested this evening. Little Miss Wise did not feel at all fresh and well rested. She hadn't slept a wink all night. Then, to her surprise, Little Miss Wise noticed something under the Christmas tree. Wrapping paper. Yes, that's right, wrapping paper. But without any presents at all. And later, when she went outside, she saw all the dustbins in Modelland were full of presents. Whatever next? Little Miss Wise thought it would be best to go home a little earlier than planned. She waved goodbye to Little Miss Country. Hello, cried Little Miss Country. Please don't come again. I won't, said Little Miss Wise to herself. Well, not without earplugs in any case. What a silly book. The end. Day 22. Mr. Worry's Christmas. As it got closer to Christmas, everyone was busy getting ready for the big day. A thick blanket of snow covered the roofs of the houses, with large flakes of snow fell all around. Who do you think was happiest at Christmas time? It was Little Miss Sunshine. Happy Christmas, Mr. Strong, she cried out when she met her friend. Well, where are you going with all those Christmas trees? To Mr. Worry's house, he replied. He's terribly worried, you know. And he continued on his way. You're late, Mr. Strong, worried Mr. Worry. I've been so worried. I'm here now, replied Mr. Strong. There's no need to worry. Oh, but there is, said Mr. Worry. I've got a great deal to worry about. Come in and I'll tell you all about it. What do you think of my tree? Asked Mr. Worry. It's marvellous, replied Mr. Strong. You don't think it's a bit wonky? Asked Mr. Worry. Yes, a little, replied Mr. Strong. But it's not a problem. I've seen lots of trees that are far worse. Oh dear, worried Mr. Worry. Then we must do something about it, quickly. If we don't all have beautiful trees, Father Christmas may be angry. Come with me, Mr. Strong. Mr. Worry picked up a box full of Christmas decorations and rushed out of his house, followed by Mr. Strong. Mr. Worry knocked on Mr. Mean's door. Hello, Mr. Mean, he said. Do you have a beautiful Christmas tree this year? Yes. I found one in the dustbin 3 years ago, replied Mr. Mean. It will do. But when Mr. Worry saw the tree, he was more worried than ever. What would Father Christmas think? With Mr. Strong's help, Mr. Worry put up a splendid tree. What's a lovely tree? A little later, Mr. Worry called to Little Miss Tidy. Hello, Little Miss Tidy, he said. Do you have a beautiful Christmas tree this year? Yes, but, she replied, I just wish I could remember where I had tidied it to. That won't do at all, replied Mr. Worry. We'll put that right for you straight away. The next person they visited was little Miss Scatterbrain. "Well, of course I've got a beautiful Christmas tree," exclaimed little Miss Scatterbrain, when Mr. Worry had explained why they were there. "Come and take a look. It's really splendid." "You call that a Christmas tree?" said Mr. Worry, very surprised to see a hat stand covered in decorations. Father Christmas won't be at all pleased. "To work, Mr. Strong." And so it continued for the rest of the day. Mr. Worry and Mr. Strong left beautifully decorated Christmas trees in every house in town. Mr. Worry had nothing more to worry about. Everyone had a beautiful Christmas tree in their home. Father Christmas would be delighted. But no, Mr. Worry was still worried. He was so worried he couldn't sleep. What if Father Christmas caught a cold? He said to himself. Or if he got stuck in a chimney. Mr. Worry checked his own chimney to make sure Father Christmas wasn't stuck in it. The next morning, Mr. Worry's were finally over. Father Christmas had been. Underneath the Christmas tree was an enormous parcel. Can you guess what was inside? A rocking chair, so that Mr. Worry could relax a little. Thanks to Mr. Worry, everyone had a visit and a present from Father Christmas. Little Miss Tidy had found coat hangers under her Christmas tree. Mr. Strong had found some heavy weights in his stocking, but unfortunately Mr. Worry was more worried than ever. Can you guess why? He was worried next Christmas wouldn't be as good as this one. Poor Mr. Worry. The end. Day 23. Little Miss Sunshine cheers everyone up. It had been snowing for days and for weeks. Snow covered everything. The sky was grey, the wind was cold, and the sun hadn't been seen for a long time. The roads were blocked, so all the bosses were late, and everyone slipped and slid as they went about their business under the grey sky. Little Miss Sunshine was the only person who was still cheerful. "What a beautiful morning," she said to Mr. Stamp, the postman. Good morning, Little Miss Sunshine," shivered the poor frozen postman. Plop! A big lump of snow slid off the roof and landed right on top of the postman's head. Brr! "Don't worry," said Little Miss Sunshine happily. "It will soon be spring, and the sun will warm you up." "The snow is so beautiful," said Little Miss Sunshine as she went for a drive. "Why is everyone so fed up? They should be enjoying themselves. I must find a way to make them smile again." The first person she met was Mr. Worry. "I'm very worried," he said. "How can I get about with all this snow? I'm worried that I will have to stay in the house all day." "Take this sledge," said Little Miss Sunshine, "and do try to stop worrying." "Oh, thank you," said Mr. Worry, smiling. "This is marvellous." And off he slid. Whee! Mr. Greedy was also worried about the weather. "When the snow melts, my house will be flooded. And what will become of all my stores of food? Everything will be ruined." "If your house is flooded," replied Little Miss Sunshine, "you'll be able to sail around your house in a fishing boat and catch fish for your tea. Just imagine, fish and chips. How delicious." "Fish and chips, my favourite," said Mr. Greedy, grinning. The next person Little Miss Sunshine met was Little Miss Splendid. "Oh me, oh my!" exclaimed Little Miss Splendid. "My splendid hat will be ruined." "But Little Miss Splendid," said Little Miss Sunshine, "the icicles shine like your eyes. They are utterly splendid." "You really think so?" smiled Little Miss Splendid, delighted by the flattery. Little Miss Sunshine realized it was going to take her a long time to cheer everyone up one by one, but she had a plan. She asked her good friend, Mr. Tickle, to help her. From up on the rooftop, they spied on all their grumpy friends. things were getting worse and worse. Oh, they're all so sad and grumpy. Mr. Tickle reached down his extraordinarily long arms and everyone burst out laughing. Tickle, tickle, tickle. And that's when the snowball fight began. Soon the grey skies and the cold wind were forgotten. Mr. Bump, who was forever falling over, was grinning an enormous grin. I can fall in the snow and not hurt myself at all, he cried. Look how happy he is. Little Miss Late, who was always late for everything, found a very quick way of getting around. She's on the sledge. Everyone thanked Little Miss Sunshine and Mr. Tickle for teaching him how to enjoy the snow. So remember, next time you are cold and the sky is grey, don't be fed up, because someone might just reach down from above and tickle you. Tickle, tickle, tickle. That was a fun story. Day 24. Mr. Mean's Good Deed. Poor little Miss Sunshine. It was Christmas Eve, and she had a cold. Tucked up in her armchair, she shivered and sniffed and snuffled and sneezed. Achoo! Somebody was particularly worried about little Miss Sunshine. Can you guess who it might be? It was Mr. Worry, of course. Happy Christmas, Mr. Worry, snuffed little Miss Sunshine to her friend, who had called to see how she was feeling. This is what we'll do, but don't open it until tomorrow morning. And she handed Mr. Worry a beautifully wrapped present. But as soon as Mr. Worry left his friend's house, he started to worry. He worried about what could be in the parcel. He worried about little Miss Sunshine's cold. He worried about her being by herself. He worried that he might catch her cold. So much to worry about. Suddenly, he had an idea. He went and knocked on Mr. Mean's door. Happy Christmas, Mr. Mean, he said. Little Miss Sunshine has a cold. Could you sit with her and keep her company? How much will you pay me for that? Asked Mr. Mean, most annoyed about being disturbed. Mr. Worry was surprised. I thought you would do it out of kindness, he said. Out of kindness, explained Mr. Mean, and slam! He shut the door on Mr. Worry's face. Look at Mr. Mean, he is very mean, isn't he? Mr. Mean went to bed. He fell asleep and began to dream. Wake up, Mr. Mean. I need to show you something, said a voice. But protested Mr. Mean, when he realized that a strange person had pulled him out of his bed and was taking him out of his room. It was a wizard. Mr. Mean had no choice but to go with a wizard. It's well known that it is difficult to resist a wizard's powers. A few minutes later, Mr. Mean found himself in front of little Miss Sunshine's window. In the middle of the room, he saw little Miss Sunshine. Next to her was a beautiful Christmas tree covered in lights, and all around her were her friends, smiling and laughing. Happy Christmas to you all, cried little Miss Sunshine. She doesn't look very ill to me, complained Mr. Mean to the wizard. What you are seeing was last Christmas, replied the wizard. Do you remember what a good time we all had? And if nobody looks after her, this is what this Christmas would look like. Oh no. All of a sudden, Mr. Mean woke up. Tears poured down his cheeks. I've just had a terrible nightmare, he cried. Poor little Miss Sunshine. She is someone who always loves and sees happiness all around her. The next morning, Mr. Worry opened his present from little Miss Sunshine. A telephone! What a good idea, said a delighted Mr. Worry. From now on, when I'm worried, I can share my worry with somebody. In fact, I'm very worried about little Miss Sunshine. And he dialed her number. I'm feeling much better, thank you, said little Miss Sunshine. Mr. Mean has made me laugh so much that I've quite forgotten my cold. Mr. Mean had gone to visit little Miss Sunshine? Mr. Worry couldn't believe it. How could someone as miserable as Mr. Mean cheer up little Miss Sunshine? It gave Mr. Worry a great deal to worry about. He even brought food for Christmas lunch, continued little Miss Sunshine. Mr. Mean bringing food? Mr. Worry was more worried than ever. And he brought me a piece of coal, continued little Miss Sunshine, laughing. We managed to get a small fire burning, but as I didn't have a present to give to Mr. Mean, I taught him a dance as my Christmas present to him. I haven't had such a good day for a long time. And Mr. Mean was delighted. He had done a good deed, and he had learnt how to dance without spending any money. The end. Thank you very much for joining me again today. Do come back so we can read more books together. Please like and subscribe. Bye.